Welcome back to On the Move with Victor Shi. This is Victor Shi, and it is Wednesday, June 21st. Today, we learned that another Supreme Court justice violated Supreme Court ethics rules by accepting lavish gifts from a conservative billionaire who then ended up arguing in front of him at the Supreme Court, and that justice didn't disclose it. And that justice is Justice Samuel Alito. There are lots of questions that must be answered that the American people deserve to know if the Supreme Court wants to gain the trust of the American people. And today we're going to talk about what you need to know about the latest reporting into Samuel Alito, what should be done about it, and some other Supreme Court news. And joining me to do that is University of Michigan law professor and co-host of one of my favorite podcasts called Strict Scrutiny, Leah Litman. Professor Litman, it is so great to see you today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So first, I have to ask you about the news regarding Samuel Alito. Last night, I was scrolling through Twitter, and you were one of the first people to inform, I think, the world that Justice Alito wrote this op-ed for the Wall Street Journal that essentially preempted this ProPublica story that ran today. I know there's a paywall that not many people can possibly access, but you did. So walk us through what Justice Alito wrote in that piece.
It was really unreal because in that piece, we learned that ProPublica was about to publish a story detailing, the lavish trips and private jet trips and vacation stays that Justice Alito had bestowed on him, including by people who, as you know, had business before the Supreme Court that Justice Alito ruled upon. But interestingly, Justice Alito decided not to respond to ProPublica's questions that they sent him before they reported the story, and instead elected to run off to the Wall Street Journal and asked to preemptively pre-butt the story. And so he did that in the fashion of an op-ed on the Wall Street Journal page. And so that's both how we learned about the, allegations that might be coming up in the ProPublica story, although of course it didn't cover everything, as also Justice Alito's choice about how to respond to the story.
I mean, how customary is it for a sitting Supreme Court justice not only to write a piece in an outlet like the Wall Street Journal, but also to respond to a piece basically before it even runs? Can you think of a moment where that's ever happened?
I cannot think of another example where a justice has been asked, here are some questions about a story we're about to break. And rather than having the Supreme Court Public Information Office release a statement or releasing a statement themselves or just answering the questions, they instead run off to an ideologically friendly op-ed page and instead opt to do something like that.
Wow. Well, I mean, what were some of the things that he was saying, in defense of the ProPublica piece in that op-ed?
Where to even start? So as I noted, he had a private jet trip given to him by this hedge fund billionaire that had a case before the Supreme Court. And Justice Alito basically said, what's the big deal? If I didn't take the seat, it just would have gone empty. So I guess that means it doesn't count. And then he said, well, ProPublica said I stayed at this nice lodge, but I stayed there before it was even renovated. And I drank the wine, and it certainly didn't taste like $1,000 wine. So as if that's supposed to make us feel better. So those were some of his defenses. There were others, but that kind of gives you some flavor.
Wow. So, let's get into this ProPublica piece because it's pretty damning and it's eerily similar to the story that ran about Justice Clarence Thomas. And I'm wondering, based off of kind of what we know, which is essentially that, Alito accepted gifts from this billionaire, failed to report it. Does this violate Supreme Court ethics rules?
So the rules require the justices to do a few different things. One is to disclose, gifts that are bestowed on them in excess of a certain dollar amount. But the previous version of the rules didn't require the justices to disclose so-called personal hospitality. And the prior rules did not define, personal hospitality beyond facilities. And Justice Alito, as well as some of his predecessors, have taken the position that under the previous version of the rules, hospitality did include transportation, such that they did not have to disclose private jet trips. Now, those rules have since been amended to make clear that hospitality does not include transportation. The rules, haven't actually been amended, but there's been a guidance issued, that now makes clear that hospitality doesn't include transportation. The ProPublica story cited several ethics experts, the people who are most familiar with this laws, and they say Justice Alito should have disclosed this trip even under the previous version of the rules. So, I think it certainly would have been better practice for him to do so, but that's kind of the lay of the land.
It's so wild to me because, the Supreme Court is, as you always talk about, it's an institution that relies so heavily on public trust and perception. And at a time when public trust is lower than ever before, what do you think the Chief Justice and what should happen within the court to start to kind of gain back that trust?
I mean, look, the Chief Justice can try to do some things, ask Justice Alito basically to behave. But the reality is, it's not like he has a ton of power over Justice Alito. I mean, he has the power to assign opinions, but because the court has, 6 Republican appointees rather than just 5, the Republican appointees can lose the Chief Justice's vote without actually changing the outcome in a case. It's not exactly clear what powers the Chief Justice in particular has. So I think if the solution is going to come, it's going to be from outside of the Supreme Court.
And in terms of outside the Supreme Court, I know Senator Durbin has hinted at the possibility of perhaps doing some sort of investigation to this. Do you think that's an appropriate course of action?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's definitely appropriate. I mean, Senator Durbin already asked nicely, the justices to appear before him, and they basically told him to pound sand. So I feel like he's got to do something beyond ask nicely, because they're basically thumbing their noses, or, in his face. This is not a tenable situation.
So, I mean, I mentioned at the top of the kind of segment that this is not the first time that we've seen this happen. Clarence Thomas also did this. And given that's the second time that this has happened, what does this kind of say to you about this sort of conduct by, really kind of right-leaning Supreme Court justices? And can you offer any explanation for why they would even do this, and why there really doesn't seem to be any kind of really responsible way that they're responding to this?
I don't pretend to understand the exact machinations of their mind, but what I can say is 2 things. One is this is a repeat story, and one of the repeat players in all of the stories is, of course, Leonard Leo, one of the people behind the Federalist Society, who was actively selecting, the federal judges in the previous administration. And I think that's important because part of the function of the Federal Society is basically creating this alternative system of networks to ensure that the judges and justices they appoint basically stay the course and continue to vote in the ways that they appointed them to do. And that's one way of understanding what all of these trips are about, basically rewarding ideologically friendly justices and giving them affirmation and pats on the back, when they kind of do the things that you want them to do. And I think that is an important part of the story. But beyond that, I think the justices truly think they're above the law, right? They see their colleagues face no consequences for doing this, so they think, like, why not grift as well?
And there have been some there's been some arguments that say, some of the liberal justices have done similar, conduct, or that, we've seen some other instances in which, there have been failed disclosures. Can you address those arguments and kind of what we've seen on the other side of the bench?
Yeah, so point me to an example of Justice Sotomayor, Kagan, or Jackson doing anything remotely similar to taking $1 million vacations on the dime of a party with business before the Supreme Court. And I would be a little bit more sympathetic to those arguments. I mean, one of the news stories that we've seen, amidst the last several months of people reporting more about the dealings of the Supreme Court justices is the fact that Justice Kagan literally turned away a gift of bagels, lox, and whitefish from some of her high school classmates who wanted to send her a gift, for having to work with some of her colleagues at the court. And she was like, look, that's too expensive and it might create a risk of bias. Basically, I will not accept. So, some justices are able to basically turn down gifts because of concerns of impropriety.
I wish I had that willpower, but I want to circle back to something that you said about Leonard Leo, and kind of another question that it makes me think about, which is, do you think that after all of kind of what we've seen so far, this raises the need for other Supreme Court reforms? And if so, what do you see as sort of the most feasible options given our current political composition in the Senate and also the House?
Absolutely. So I think the reality is, in this divided Congress, we're probably not going to get any meaningful Supreme Court reforms from. But I don't think that should stop people from trying to make the case for Supreme Court reforms for, the next moment when Democrats actually do control both houses of Congress as well as the presidency. Because I think Supreme Court reform is one of the most important, issues facing the country and the democracy that we are going to have to confront. And that package of reforms has to include, lessening the authority of the court, ensuring that they are not above the law or above democracy, and other things too.
Absolutely. So let's turn and talk about the Supreme Court term so far. There have been a couple of really noteworthy cases that have dropped this term already, and I want to start off with Allen v. Mulligan, which surprised a lot of people. Can you briefly walk us through what that opinion held and how big of a victory we should take that decision?
Yeah, so Allen versus Milligan is a case about vote dilution under the Voting Rights Act, Section 2. And vote dilution happens where legislatures draw districts in ways that basically try to dilute the ability of voters of color to elect the candidates of their choice by, say, packing them all into one district and then spreading them among the remaining districts so they're not actually able to elect the candidate of their choice in those other districts. And Allen basically affirmed a decision by a unanimous 3-judge panel that concluded that Alabama had violated Section 2 when it drew districts in ways that split up the black belt and did not allow voters of color to elect the candidate of their choice in a second congressional district. So the decision is important because it reaffirms that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is actually a meaningful tool to facilitate multiracial democracy and prevent politicians from basically insulating politicians from the will of minority voters, from having to actually represent their interests.
And do you think that'll prevent or maybe send a message to the Republican states right now that are trying to make it harder for specific groups of people to vote that, the Supreme Court is actually going to take action, perhaps rule against those? Or do you think that Republican states will keep on doing what they're doing?
I think Republican states are likely to continue trying to suppress votes and to, undermine voting rights in other ways as well, because, the Supreme Court in other cases basically allowed states to impose voting preconditions like voter identification requirements or, preventing people from returning another voter's ballot or allowing states to discount votes that were cast on the wrong precinct. And so the Supreme Court is still not a friend to voting rights, although this decision is a welcome reaffirmation of the idea that the Voting Rights Act does prevent some ways of diluting voting rights.
Definitely. And are there any other Supreme Court decisions that were surprising from this term that we should know about?
Another decision that's a little wonky, but I think important is Tlefsky. And that's a decision that held that if you are a private party and you participate in a federal spending program like Medicaid, for example, and the government violates your rights under that spending clause program, that the general civil rights statute potentially allows you to sue for those violations to protect your rights. And that's a really important decision because so much of federal law and federal programs are run through the spending clause, whether that's Medicaid or health and welfare programs. So that decision was really important as well, and I think surprising to people.
Interesting. I know you talk a lot about this on strict scrutiny, but I want you to kind of talk about this for our audience, which is there's interesting insights that perhaps we might be able to draw from what we've seen from some of the justices so far. This is, of course, Justice Katanji Brown-Jackson's first term on the court. What do we know about her so far, and what other insights could we possibly take away from other justices and where they fall based off of some of the opinions that we've read?
So Justice Jackson's, I think, performance during oral argument has been really transformative. I think she has really moved the needle and changed, right, how justices are perceiving certain cases because of her really pointed and powerful questions. The Voting Rights Act case is an example of that, and I think the spending clause case is potentially as well. She's also emerged as a really smart voice on issues of statutory interpretation. We've seen the Republican appointed justices, as well as some Democratic appointed ones, say, textualism, textualism, textualism. That is how we interpret statutes. Whereas Justice Jackson has really said, no, we need to consider why Congress enacted this statute, what it's trying to do, and the kind of context in which it emerged. So that's kind of what I would say about the court's newest justice. The other justices, I'm happy to add some thoughts on as well, but it's a little difficult to encapsulate in just 10 to 15 seconds. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, what are some other Supreme Court cases that are left that will be dropped that you think that our audience should pay attention to? It's June 21st, so it means that we probably are going to be seeing some cases drop in the next few weeks.
We've got a lot of big ones coming up. We've got a challenge to the President's Student Debt Relief Program. That's a pair of cases that people should definitely be watching. We have a challenge to the continued future of affirmative action and race-conscious remedies in higher education. We also have an important LGBTQ equality case about whether individuals can basically opt out of non-discrimination statutes that protect the LGBTQ community. And finally, we have a big voting rights case out of North Carolina about whether state constitutions and state courts can protect voting rights.
Well, all eyes will be on the Supreme Court. And I have one last question for you, which is, I know you talk to a lot of students because you're a professor, and I'm wondering what you think the role of young people is right now in our legal system during such what it feels like an unprecedented moment in history.
So many roles. One is now is the time to be involved, right? To learn about the Supreme Court and educate yourself so that you are in a position to potentially change it, right? And change our legal institutions for the better. I think the more you know, right, the more you are able to do. And second, and relatedly, is like be creative, right? We are facing down, right, real problems in this country. Some of those problems are from the Supreme Court, right, and its relationship to our democracy and the potential for multiracial democracy. And so think about how our institutions should be structured so that they actually represent the people, all people.
Well, Professor Litman, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you so much for all that you do to keep us informed and knowledgeable about the Supreme Court.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, thanks so much. Well, Professor Litman is always amazing. Again, as I mentioned at the top of the segment, she co-hosts this great podcast with two other law professors, Melissa Murray as well as Kate Shaw. Kate has been on this show before, so we are all familiar with Kate, but check out that podcast. They do weekly podcasts that does deep dives into the Supreme Court and the legal culture that surrounds it. So Strict Scrutiny is the podcast name. So thank you, Professor Litman, for joining us today and talking about just really what feels like such an important day in our democracy, seeing another Supreme Court justice act so flagrantly against the rules and the kind of rules and guidelines that are within the Supreme Court. So we'll all be watching that very closely. There's some other news happening right now, which is that moments ago, or I guess a few hours ago, the House voted to basically allow this motion to censure Representative Adam Schiff. This is the second time that they brought this motion to the floor. The last time, 20 Republicans voted against it, so Representative Adam Schiff remained. But this time, those 20 Republicans who voted against it the first time voted for it. So that motion is now advanced, which means that there is going to be a final vote probably in the next half an hour or hour or so, and members will vote whether or not to censure Adam Schiff. And it's just another kind of moment that I hope we can all remember, because I know not a lot of us, or I guess, not a lot of people out in the world beyond this show probably pay attention to Congress and pay attention to what's happening inside those halls every day. But it's important for all of us to remember this is what they're choosing to spend their taxpayer money on, our taxpayer money on. They're not choosing to do, actual meaningful policy legislation or any meaningful policy changes. They're choosing to spend it on, censuring someone like Representative Adam Schiff for simply investigating the case into the collusion between Donald Trump and Russia. And so it's just this kind of another pattern of Republicans not really doing what Americans and what their constituents want them to do. And for all of us, I think it's really important for us to pay attention and really understand what Republicans are doing with their time and that what they're not choosing to do with their time. And this is what they're trying to do. And none of us should stand for it. And luckily, Representative Schiff, he's not going anywhere. He is still on fire. Today, he was doing a lot of hearings into the John Durham probe. He spoke on the House floor, just a powerful and a constant voice. But it's sad to see that this is what Republicans are focusing on. And as people who are engaged in democracy, as people who are paying attention, as people who have a stake in our democracy, we should all pay attention and tell all of our friends that this is what Republicans are choosing to do with our taxpayer money. And I think it's all up to all of us to really get that message out there so that people know, this is what Republicans choose to do with our money and with our time and with their time, and we all have to vote them out in 2024 because every single one of them is up for re-election in 2024. So that's the immediate news that's happening right now. Tomorrow I will be back with another episode of On the Move with Representative Jasmine Crockett, who will give us some insight into what's happening in the House. We like to do some updates for you about what's happening in the House, so she will join me tomorrow. I'm sure you can all or you all maybe remember her from her really viral moments on Twitter and owning people during live committee hearings. So we'll talk about that, how she's chosen to respond to those people, her strategy for doing so, and also what people need to know about this Congress and the fight ahead. So join us tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific, right here on youtube.com/Politicon or on Twitter at my Twitter handle, VictorShe2020. Thank you all for watching this episode of On the Move with Professor Leah Litman, and I will see you all tomorrow. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.